I'm Pranamya, and you're watching Pages of the Globe. So if you're new to my channel and you're like, I do not want to see a 10-year-old girl reading about these stories, first of all, I'm not 10 years old, and second of all, please watch the intro video up on my channel. And if you're like, I do not want to do that, girl, that's fine, whatever. The gist of it is basically, first of all, I'm not 10 years old, and second of all, please trust me to read these stories and then give you a proper analysis and summary and a little bit about the author, about these stories. I have the right credentials, so just, sit back and relax. Today's story is Harrison Bergeron, the very, very popular short story Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut, is how I think you pronounce the last name. I have seen various pronunciations of this name, but I'm going to stick with Vonnegut because that is the most popular pronunciation I've seen on the internet. But yes, without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about the author. So Kurt Vonnegut was this very influential American writer who was known for his unique blend of satire, science fiction, and dark humor. His works often explore the themes of human error, the absurdity of war, and the quest for meaning in different universe. Vonnegut's most famous novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, which you've definitely probably heard of, is a semi-autobiographical account of his experiences during World War II, particularly the bombing of Dresden. Other notable works include Cat's Cradle, Breakfast of Champions, and The Sirens of Titan. His distinctive voice and innovative narrative techniques have left a lasting impact on contemporary literature. Now, he is the same author who wrote Harrison Bergeron, which is a very, very popular short story. It was published in 1961, and it is a satirical dystopian portrayal of this future society where the government enforces extreme equality. And I'm not gonna say anything more than that because it's actually a very interesting story. But it is one of Vonnegut's most well-known short stories and reflects his characteristic use of dark humor and social commentary. If you are anyone who loves a little bit of satire, a little bit of dystopia, you will love this story. I am someone who loves satire, and this story was so interesting with me. I read it when I was in middle school, and it's just stuck with me because it has so much depth to it. And I think if you're anyone like that, if you like political commentary as well, you will love this story. Without further ado, let's get on with it. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law. They were equal every which way. No one was smarter than anybody else. No one was better looking than anybody else. No one was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the H.G. men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm. "That was a real pretty dance, that dance they just did," said Hazel. "Huh?" said George. "That dance. It was nice," said Hazel. "Yep," said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good. No better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and birds of birdshot, and their faces were masked, so that no one seeing a free and graceful gesture or pretty face would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did 2 out of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. It sounded like someone hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, said George. I'd think it would be really interesting, hearing all the different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All the things they think up. Said George. Only if I was handicapped, General, you know what I would do, said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper General, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday, just chimes, kind of in honor of religion. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapped general. Good as anybody else, said George. Who knows better than I do about being normal, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that. Boys, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white, trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor and were holding their temples. All of a sudden, he looked so tired. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in the canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. You've been so tired lately and kind of wore out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a tiny little hole in the bag and maybe take out a couple of them lead balls, just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 for every ball I take out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take a few out when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sat around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people tried to get away with it, and pretty soon we'd be right back to the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. I reckon it'd fall apart, said Hazel. What would? Said George blankly. Society, said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." He finally gave up and handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. That's all right, Hazel said to the announcer. He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and the most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her warm was a warm, luminous, timeless melody. Excuse me, she said, and she began to, again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He's a genius and an athlete, and is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as incredibly dangerous. A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen, upside down, then sideways, upside down, and then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison Bergeron against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween in hardware. No one had ever worn heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the HG men could think of them. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him wanging headaches. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. "If you see this boy," said the ballerina, do not try to reason with him. There was a shriek of door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again, as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and as well as he might have, for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crashing tune. "My God," said George, "that must be Harrison." The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George opened his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. "I am the Emperor," cried Harrison. "Do you hear? I am the Emperor. Everyone must do as I say at once." He stamped his foot, and the studio shook. "Even as I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbled, sickened, I am a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become." Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock and secured his head hardness. The bars snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber-nosed ball, revealing a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. "I should now select my empress," he said, looking down on the cowering people. "Let the first woman who dares to raise her feet claim her mate and her throne." A moment passed, and then a ballerina rose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the metal handicap from her ear, snapped off the physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. "Now," said Harrison, taking her hand, "shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance?" "Music," he commanded. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps, too. "Play your best," he told them, "and I'll make you barons and dukes and earls." The music began. It was normal at first, cheap, silly, false, but Harrison snatched 2 musicians from their chair, waved them like batons as he sang the music as he wanted it played. He slammed them back down in their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely, as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weight to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of land abandoned, but the laws of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gamboled, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers near to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air, inches below the ceiling, as they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the Emperor and Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burnt out. Harrison turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in the beer, pausing while a handicap signal shook him up. Then he sat down again. "You've been crying?" he said to Hazel. "Yup," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. That was the sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You could say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel. "I could tell that one was a doozy." The end. Alright, so that was Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. Now, this story is so famous, like I said before. You've probably read it in school, you've probably read it at work. It's incredibly popular. Now, before I jump straight into the analysis and the themes and the literary devices used, I'm first just going to go over a quick plot summary. Now, it is the year 2081, and every American is fully equal, meaning no one is stupider, no one is uglier, no one is weaker, slower than anyone else. They're all equal. And to ensure this, they place these, first of all, like physical handicaps, as in on stronger people, they'll put hundreds of pounds of like birdshot in bags and then hang them on people. And it seems so incredibly uncomfortable, but that way everyone is equal in strength. And as for mentally, what they'll do is that they'll put these mental handicaps that play noises in their brain, right in their ear, and it'll be like the worst noise ever, like guns shooting 200 times, and they'll play that over and over again in their head, in the head of smarter people, so that they aren't smarter than anybody else and they don't try and take advantage of anybody else. And we're introduced to this couple, Hazel and George. And George is very smart, he's very strong, and we know that because he has some awful handicaps. Whereas Hazel is completely normal, she's very average, so she doesn't really have any handicaps. But their son, their 14-year-old son, Harrison Bergeron, is this incredibly intelligent, incredibly strong guy that's been taken away. Now, Hazel's lack of awareness is due to her very average intelligence, and so those who possess average intelligence aren't able to think for extended stretches of time. And George can't comprehend the tragedy of his son being taken away because he's wearing a radio basically 24 hours a day. And these noises that the government broadcasts interrupts the thoughts. Now they're watching ballerinas dance on TV, and Hazel's crying, but she doesn't even know why. And she's just talking about how pretty the dance is, and we kind of learn how these dancers are probably very pretty because they're wearing the ugliest masks ever. And they're wearing some, like, huge physical handicaps. And in the middle, there's an announcement. And what I thought was so interesting was that the announcement, the guy who announces, the announcer, I guess, he has an incredibly bad speech impediment because every single announcer has speech impediments. And he can't overcome his impediment, so he hands the bulletin to a ballerina. And Hazel actually says, "Oh my God, you know what? He's trying so hard, he needs to get a raise just for trying." And then the ballerina starts talking, and she's reading in this beautiful voice, and she's like, "Oh wait, sorry, I don't want anyone to be jealous." And she starts speaking this awful, like, growly voice. And the bulletin's about Harrison, and he's like, and we see that even though he is 14 years old, he's 14, he's 7 feet tall, and he's super strong, he's incredibly intelligent, he's super handsome. And after this, like, noise, we see that Harrison himself has appeared, and he rips off all his handicaps, and he looks like a god. And he's declared that he's the emperor. It's sort of this fit of like manicness. And he even declares that he's going to have an empress. And so this ballerina rises to her feet. And he removes her handicaps, and you see this beautiful woman. And then he orders the musicians to play, and he and the empress starts dancing, and they're kissing each other, and they're just doing amazingly. And it's like this beautiful scene of romance. And then as they're kissing, the leader, Diana Moon Glampers, which is the strangest name ever, comes into the studio and kills both of them as they're kissing, which is this incredibly tragic event. And George and Hazel are obviously incredibly, like, it's this awful thing, and then because Hazel has incredibly average intelligence, she immediately forgets about it, and George's handicap prevents him from thinking about it far too long, so they forget about it. And the very end, there's this awful noise in George's head, and Hazel goes, "Oh, you can tell that one was a doozy." And then George, like a saying, he says, "Oh, you can say that again, like, for sure." And then she says it again. And that's where the story ends. And it's such an interesting story because before I go straight into the analysis, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own experience reading this. And I remember the first time I read this, I was in, like, middle school, I think. And, not middle school. It might have been high school. And our teacher was like, "Before we read the story, I want you guys to talk to me about competition." And he was like, "Do you guys think competition should exist or not?" And it was my LA class. And the room was divided, but like most people were like, "No, competition is bad because competition invokes jealousy and envy, and jealousy are two very bad things." And I remember it was just me on the yes, we should have competition side, and this other girl. And this girl, she was talking about how there should be competition because of sports. I don't really know what she was talking about. To be fair, she wasn't really paying attention the entire time, but she was like, "Yeah, we should have competition because we need it for sports." And so the LA teacher, he asked me, and he was like, "Why do you think there should be competition in the world? Doesn't competition invoke bad things?" And I was like, "Yes, but with competition comes innovation. And without competition, people aren't constantly trying. And if you don't constantly try, then you're stuck in this, like, kind of rut. And at the end of the day, there are people that are going to have higher than average intelligence. And what is the point of not using that intelligence?" And so I thought it was so interesting to read the story and see that the government was trying to make everyone equal. Because, yes, it seems right. Like in the beginning when you read it, you're like, yeah, everyone should be equal. That's the way it is. But then when you read how they make people equal, you're like, no, this is wrong. So going into like a deeper study of exactly what happens, first I'm going to go over like the historical context and how Vonnegut, he kind of gives this political and social critique. Now, Harrison Bergeron, this story was kind of released in like the 1960s, and so it offered very vigorous political and social criticism of both America in general and like the America of the 1960s. The political system depicted in this story is distinctly American and founded on the principles of egalitarianism, which holds that people should be equal in every single way possible. Equality is this beloved principle enshrined in America's Declaration of Independence in the phrase, "All men are created equal." But Vonnegut describes how even an idea as established as egalitarianism can be perverted when enforced by an authoritarian government. And I think it's so interesting because as someone who's from America, and if you're not, even then I'm sure, you've heard us, we're constantly talking about freedom and equality. And it does very much often turn into us saying everyone is born equal and everyone should be equal. But it's so interesting because the goal of equality is taken to this hypothetical extreme, and it's decided that people must be forced to be equal to one another in their appearance, behavior, achievements, and it leaves no room for creativity, talent, or individuality. Now, this is kind of a direct critique for totalitarianism, because you see it as like, when it was published in 1961, we were engaged with the Soviet Union in a Cold War. And we also had like recently struggled from the McCarthy era, when suspected communists were accused and blacklisted from artistic, literary, and political communities. And so this futuristic American society operates on similarly oppressed or repressive principles like the accused communists of the McCarthy era. And anyone that's not conforming to society's accepted standards is sought out and punished. And then it suggests that state-mandated equality is not equality at all, but rather a means by which the government is able to control and suppress individuality. Now, more modern readers of today have interpreted the dystopia depicted as a preview of what might happen to America if trends such as psychiatric drugs are allowed to proliferate. The characters in Vonnegut's stories are very passive. They don't think, they're very calm. And although the means of achieving this mental state are externally applied to the body rather than internally applied to the mind, some readers draw a parallel between the noises that destroy George's ability to think and the drugs that make modern Americans tranquil and detached. Because honestly, the way even when I was reading about George and Hazel, the way they were acting, it was so detached from reality. It felt like they had just taken an edible or something. And it just felt like they didn't understand what was going on, and they didn't want to understand because they had such average intelligence. And so these critics argue that the characters in Harrison Bergeron, who all lack passion, intelligence, creative ability, should be interpreted as a warning about what happens to the members of society that prize calm happiness above artistry or intelligence. And I think this draws very parallels to when you're thinking about, for example, just art, plain art. There's a quote by Banksy, I believe, who says, "Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable." And I think this is such a powerful quote. But not only that, it reminds me of this Harrison Bergeron story because it shows that those who want this calm, peace, and quiet, they aren't ready to be shown this extraordinary talent of passion and intelligence. And the truth is, at the end of the day, it's that passion and intelligence that has brought us here. And while obviously this sort of future hopefully will never happen, it doesn't seem like it will, it gives the reader something to chew on about how not necessarily, and I definitely did not read the story as something saying that, like, stop saying that everyone needs to be equal, because that's never going to happen. I did not take that story in that way at all. I was reading a couple reviews about it, and there were actually a lot of people that were like, this is a very racist story because they're trying to get people to stop talking about equality and how people of all races should be equal. But I don't think that is the way we should interpret this, as in, like, stop saying people need to be equal all the time. I think the story is simply there. It's merely there to say, A, there is a very big danger of totalitarian governments, which is what specifically Kurt was trying to show with this story. And B, the message I think we ourselves should interpret from this is that as members of society, instead of prizing this calm happiness, we need to prize artistry and intelligence. We need to prize the more important things. And taking it into, like, applying that message to nowadays, for example, this is kind of a reach. But for example, we'll see a lot of influencers out there in our world, and we'll see a lot of kids be like, oh, I want to become a content creator when I grow up, or oh, I want to be an influencer, because it's a very easy job and it brings in a lot of money if you succeed. However, the issue with that is that it doesn't require a lot of brain cells. If I'm being completely honest, and I don't think it's, at the end of the day, yes, you need to be a little bit creative with your ideas, but truly, with, for example, TikTok coming in, you could really just do a dancing video and boom, you're set for life. And I think what that does is that it encourages kids to drop out of high school, drop out of college, not go to college, not get that education, not get that sort of worldliness, not get that perspective and just jump straight into social media. And it's churning out people with average intelligence. We're seeing these incredibly, like when political topics come up, when there's these wars going on, for example, the situation in Gaza, and we see that these influencers aren't able to speak up on it. And it's not necessarily because, yes, they don't want to, but also we're seeing that they literally just are so uneducated. They don't understand the context of it. They don't understand, and they aren't doing any research. They're just taking the word of other people because, first of all, they don't want to do that research, and second of all, they don't have that sort of educational context of anything. And I think that's so important because as a society, we're starting to prize more things like beauty and appearance and social media followers instead of prizing the thing that keeps this world running, which is intelligence. Now, those are my 2 cents. Please comment down your analysis. I love to read your guys's, because some of you guys have some incredibly smart comments and observations to make, and I think it's so interesting. So please comment down your analysis. But remember to like, share, subscribe, and also comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. Bye!